So it's going to be an exciting future. But those are the data points I would use.
All right, and sorry to monopolize the time. I appreciate your response,
yes,
and you know, I think it helps all of us if those if that data is available. And I know that you know, searching around the websites that and there's a lag in data, but there seems to be a lack of markers of excellence that we know is there, but that would help students and parents want to go to the come to this community.
I'll be happy to come back once we get the PSAT results and share them with you and answer any questions that you may have for a group of our students.
So, and again, not to play, you know, but here's what I just saw some data released on the SAT scores DODEA-wide that seems to indicate we're really that when you compare us with the states in mathematics, I think there were only 2 states that compared worse than DODEA. And I think Maine and Texas, I think, were the only states that did worse on the SAT than DODEA. I was just curious about, is there some effort DODEA-wide? I noticed, you know, I've heard you say, hey, we've identified this as a problem area. I heard Dr. Washington say we've identified this as a problem area. I'm just, and I was concerned. I don't know how we're doing as a school on the SAT, because again, the data hasn't been available, but I just see DODEA-wide, we've had issues.
That's right, right, right. The SAT. Now, matter of fact, last year when I looked at, they usually take it over, SAT is preferred overseas. Last year when I was at Fort Campbell, we only had 3 students take the SAT. So I think that's the first problem. You know, I would prefer that we work towards the ACT and ACT prep, and that because we can use that information and that assessment to improve instruction for that individual student. And I think if we develop something like that through the SAT, if we have enough, when that N factor is not high enough, it's irrelevant. So, you know, I would prefer the ACT, and I would like to, you know, administer it and use that to work with the staff to improve their scores over time. But you're correct. But I think it's only because our students aren't exposed to that assessment and the style of it. So we can't prepare them properly. I mean, we can use a PSAT, and I would like to see us push that down to the 8th grade and buy it for our 8th graders and give them that assessment so we can establish more longitudinal data over time with individual students that I think would help. That would be an area that I would propose.
Do we have any specific programs geared toward students, you know, in academic skills, geared toward ACT prep, SAT prep, any courses of that nature?
We have an ACT prep, or do we have a prep for ACT still, Jackie?
We don't have a class for it, but we advertise the March to Success program, as well as we've advertised it's called fortest.com, I think is the website. We've advertised that. They've got practice tests available for ACT, SAT, ASVAB, AP classes. The teachers have done an ACT test question of the day during target time in the past. We've focused quite a bit on that. But we don't have a specific class. No, DODEA does not have a class like that. I'm talking about in-house that we can put all 367 kids in. We can't put everybody in virtual school.
Right, right.
Okay, thank you. So, and then I understand the format for the SAT is changing as well.
Yes.
So I think that will probably cause some additional.
Right, exactly. And you know, if we had enough students take that assessment, then we could practice with that style and prepare our students to respond to a prompt or whatever the case may be. So it's something that's, you know, you got to practice taking a certain type of test. the formatting of it.
Yeah, no, and I understand, and I hate to come back and belabor the point, but your assessment is that our students are taking the ACT because that's what is generally required by colleges in the area. And then I would go back to, and I don't know the answer to this question, I would tell you once upon a time, the service academies all required the SAT.
Correct.
I don't know if that's still the case.
I believe it is. I think they accept either, but,
They accept that.
all right.
And then, okay. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Other questions?
Anything else that I can respond to on what's happening at Knox, I'll be glad to. And I don't mind getting put on the spot. I get it about 70 times a day.
I understand. Thank you very much.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you. All right.
Okay, so with that, our next item on the agenda is a briefing on the special education program. Mr. Labriola, thank you for attending.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's my understanding that you have what I prepared in your packet, so I brought handouts for the group here. This is a very general overview, one that that Mr. Leitzel asks me for each year to put on the website. So I updated it for this particular time of year. Special education within the Department of Defense schools is different than special education outside the gate in some very important ways. Not only in terms of how we identify students and therefore the number of students that we have identified and made eligible, but in terms of the number of staff that we have to service them. For example, for each special education teacher allotment, we receive a program aide, and we additionally have what are called supplemental instructional support paraprofessionals. I sometimes get calls from receiving school districts. Hardin County Schools, for example, has asked me if every kid we send to them has aid support. And I say, no, it's not everyone, but it's along the lines of 1 in 10, which is a very different experience for our students here compared to the students outside the gate. So we have approximately 3 times the staff to service their needs. We also have eligibility criteria which are very inclusive, in my opinion. For example, when it comes to identification of a specific learning disability, most states will use something called an aptitude achievement discrepancy as the main eligibility tool. And what that means is measured cognitive ability differs from actual measured academic achievement in, for the state of Kentucky, for example, 4% or less of the population. That means that's a very exclusive eligibility criteria. For the Department of Defense schools, it's 10th percentile plus 1 standard error of measurement, which is typically around 3 points, and a measured information processing deficit. To tell you the truth, when I first looked at our eligibility guidelines when I was a school psychologist many years ago, my fear was, how do you say no? We'll end up with almost everyone referred in special education. Fortunately, that fear didn't come to fruition. That's not the case. But we've had as many as 15% of our student population eligible for special education and related services. The average nationwide is 10 to 12%. We're currently at 12%. So we're in line with the national average. But we have many fewer students than we used to have. I used to do this presentation for the Board of Education on special education when we had 400 special education students. We're now at 156, and it was supposed to be less than that. So it's gone up from 129 to 156 since the beginning of the school year. Now, as you can see, our when I analyze the Aspen Special Education Database, we have 23% of our students that are within special education identified with specific learning disabilities, 29% with communication impairments, those that'll see a speech and language therapist generally, 13% with developmental delays, and 35% with autism spectrum disorders or various educationally debilitating health conditions. It is by far and away the most frequent, it's most frequently the case, I should say, that the parents I speak to have students on the autism spectrum. And that's because the Exceptional Family Member Program considers not only what we have on post, but what we have within a reasonable distance around the post in terms of services for sending students with autism spectrum disorders to our school district. That's been one of our biggest challenges. I've spoken with various folks on post about perhaps assuming that we can do too much at some point, especially in times where you have a reduction in staff. But our staff handles most problems very, very well. In fact, I told the CSE committee at McDonald that if I had a student with the particular disability that we were dealing with, I would like them to be the CSE. And I meant every word of it. They really, that's Child Study Committee. They really, really did a fine job of dealing with all of the complexities that exist for children with special needs. The staff consists currently of 11 teachers, special education teachers, 13 program paraprofessionals, 19 SIS paraprofessionals, 2 assessors and an assessor clerk, that's a speech and language assessor, as well as a special education assessor, an assessor clerk. This is so that our special education teachers can spend more time providing instruction and not doing assessments as they used to. 1 school psychologist, an occupational therapist, a half-time physical therapist, 3 speech and language therapists, and one of those speech and language therapists is an autism teacher leader. I'd like for that position to be a separate position so that she could service the whole district more often. Because this particular speech therapist has expertise in assisting with students on the autism spectrum disorder. And what we've learned about students on the spectrum is if you've met one student with an autism spectrum disorder, you've met one student with an autism spectrum disorder. You can't assume that there'll be similarities, or you might be misguided in that assumption. There's such distinctly different needs for each student. And lastly, this is a while ago now, but it seems like yesterday to me, 2009, 2010, for the very first time, the Office of Special Needs from the Pentagon sent a group of monitors to Kentucky to look at Fort Campbell and Fort Knox, and we were very pleased with the outcome. We were found to be in compliance in all areas. Dr. Calvano has reminded us that once we achieve that level, it's important for us to stay at that level, so we're working to do that. And I update these data every year, so I'd be happy to do it again or answer any questions. I know that's kind of a brief overview. Any particular questions you might have?
Well, okay, so let me go back. You mentioned some of the difficulties with autism that based on the fact that you have autism, I think in DSM-5 covered a whole bunch of things that were in DSM-4 were different disorders, right?
Correct.
And so so I apologize for speaking, but in a more technical terms, but so my understanding though is that we've lumped a whole bunch of things together and called them autism, and to make such that it makes autism perhaps not sufficiently descriptive. Is that fair?
Yes, especially for some of the higher functioning students on the autism spectrum disorder. It's what used to be called Asperger's disorder, for example, no longer exists. It's all called an autism spectrum disorder. For some of the higher functioning students, we, believe it or not, have some more difficulties sort of adapting the program to meet their needs. Because I think in part, sometimes assumptions are made. Well, they're high functioning, therefore they'll be able to figure it out, and that's a dangerous assumption. That will lead us to underserve some students, I fear. So we've got some learning to do in that regard. As we do with all of the incoming students, they're all very, very different, but especially on the spectrum.
Okay, and so you mentioned something, I think you said 35% of the children who have special needs in the school are autism spectrum children, and so that would be 35% of the overall 12% population.
Correct, but that's to be a bit more specific, it's 35% with autism spectrum disorders and various educationally debilitating health impairments. They might have a what's called an other health impairment. Students with ADHD, for example, which is often a comorbid condition, would be eligible under the category of other health impaired, or a traumatic brain injury, or those are usually much lower frequency issues, but we've had a large spike in autism spectrum disorders.
So I guess my question then is, what do we do, knowing that parents are probably the least objective but most knowledgeable in terms of the education of their children and the needs that their children require? Is there anything that we do or programs? How do we educate parents in the process? Something that we do to, I guess the word I would say is make them good consumers of this system.
Well, one of the things we do is when parents call me and say that they're coming to the school district, I'm very honest with them about what we have. And we lean sometimes too heavily on our autism teacher leader. I learned a while back that she'll do things called social stories. For example, prepare a packet for an incoming student where there are pictures of the school and pictures of the individuals that he or she is going to meet to ease that transition. Then when parents come, we're always we're inform them that anytime they want to have a meeting, that we're willing to have a meeting, and that is the case, even though if a parent asks for a meeting, we technically have 10 days to have it. It's one of our requirements. We're happy to do that so that we stay in communication with parents. I notice that there are problems when we fall out of communication with parents. If either parents don't spend any time calling us or we don't have more frequent meetings, then we'll have some miscommunication and maybe some difficulties. There are various things on post to help parents as well. There's an autism support group. I give Miss Land's number to parents as well, and her email, and say, you know, our autism teacher leader would be happy to assist you with this, because she has great expertise in knowing how to, you got to know how to talk to parents sometimes. And that's, it seems kind of funny, but I tell our staff that I can almost look in somebody's eyes and know what to say, and more importantly, what not to say. Because I see too many meetings sort of get off track, focusing on the wrong kinds of things, or not recognizing that a parent is very anxious, or a parent is upset about something, and not stopping for a moment and addressing that so that we can move on. Those kinds of things. So I'm sure that there's more that we can do. I'm sure that there's more that we can do, but we are continuing to learn how to deal with this epidemic in terms of autism spectrum disorders.
Okay. So I guess to come back to the point of if I'm a parent concerned about that my child receives special accommodations, or I have special concerns about the needs of my child, where do I educate myself, or how do I educate myself on that process to get those needs met?
Well, one of the things that I would recommend is that we have the parent call me, and I will let them know what we have on post and off post to get them the information that they need.
Okay. And I'm sorry to monopolize the questions here. So you mentioned that the Office of Special Needs came and gave an audit. What sort of things did they look at?
They look at, they had certain hot button issues. One of the things they looked at, which they were pleased to see that we did, was we got 3-year-olds into school, 3-year-olds with developmental delays, that is, by their 3rd birthday. In fact, Lori Sebastian, Dr. Sebastian said to me, we don't see this in very many places where they actually have them in by their 3rd birthday. They spend a lot of time looking at records to make sure that they're in order, that the IEP is on top, that we're not taking goals that we've used previously and just recycling them, that the goals make sense in relation to what's called the present level of performance. It's got to make sense. They look at how we take minutes. Although I have to say they've kind of waffled on this issue a little bit. They said we take minutes which are too long and don't tell the story of, don't tell this student's story of what we did and why we're doing it and that kind of thing. But what we found over time is that the more detailed we can be in terms of minutes, the better off we are. I was very happy in one particular case that we took the kind of minutes that we did, because it verified all of the things that we do, some of which were being assumed, it was assumed that we weren't doing. So The emphasis for the monitoring team was on individual services for students. Not that we just have classrooms set up. For example, we set up a classroom and we say it's an autism classroom and we send kids there. It's what are we actually doing to meet their individually identified needs. They said that we were doing too much assessment, that we put kids through too much assessment. And maybe me being a school psychologist previously, that was kind of my bias, that you collect current data to the maximum extent possible and use that data. But they were saying we were putting kids through too much assessment. And those are generally the highlights of the things that they look at. They had never been to the state of Kentucky before, and that's why they came to visit us. It wasn't that there was some kind of deficiency noted, or they said, we've never been to Kentucky, so we're coming to Campbell and Knox for the first time.
Yes, let me shift gears here just a second. So when we have those special needs requirements, and I know that they can be various, several, right? So when you look at, it could be extra time for testing, could be reading test questions, could be testing in a separate room, et cetera. How are those requirements communicated to substitute teachers?
Not exactly sure how they're communicated to substitute teachers. I think we'd have to rely on the classroom teacher to communicate that to the substitute, because they have to sign saying they've received the IEP, the times on the IEP, and those are generally accommodations, and the accommodations. And they would have to communicate that in their substitute plan to the substitute. But if that's not happening, I need to know about that.
Okay, thank you. And then, do we have any specific special needs out there that we've been unable to accommodate?
Generally, no. Most of the time when parents call me, I ask them to please send me an IEP. I try not to make promises. And I say then, let's review the IEP. Let me review the IEP. I'll give you a call back and we'll decide together what we're going to do about this. One of our trickiest areas, besides autism spectrum disorders, is it's really a medical term that's used for a reading disability. It's the area of dyslexia. There are many ways to deal with dyslexia, but there are groups of people who believe that the only way that you can successfully deal with dyslexia is to use something called the Orton-Gillingham method, which came out of Yale University years ago and spawned the Susan Barton method, the Wilson reading method. Those methods share some of the same interventions that ReadWell uses, for example, a program that we use, that Read 180 uses. But there are some parents, because of the folks that have advised them, say, unless you're doing Orton-Gillingham or Wilson or Barton, then you're not properly serving my child. Currently, for example, we have 3 students being evaluated. We have contracted for an independent third-party evaluation just to make sure that we fully understand their needs in terms of dyslexia and any other area, instructional area that might be affected by that, so that we can properly serve them, so we can take that data and hopefully put together a meaningful program for those students. So if it's any area, it's dyslexia, but I can't sit here and say we're absolute experts on autism either. Yeah, so we're constantly learning, and we'll always have to.
But do we have any budgetary issues or concerns that we've met? We had a parent, for instance, bring up at a previous board meeting their concerns about busing and busing requirements. I think those issues have since been addressed, but I just wondered if there were any other budgetary issues or concerns that you have that where we're not meeting the needs of students as a result of their required accommodations.
Not that I'm aware of. We generally receive the resources that we need and can request additional if necessary. Whether that's, I've been talking with people today and yesterday, for example, about staffing. One of the issues with having SIS paraprofessionals is, I believe that DODEA sees it this way too. They believe they've opened a can of worms. I could spend all of my time dealing with aid requests because it's almost a knee-jerk reaction. Every time we have a student problem, they say, well, perhaps he needs an aid. And of course, we can't provide, nor would it be appropriate to provide an aid for every student that has a need. But we receive the resources that we need by and large, and if we need something, we request it.
So the question I have on that would be, if there's an issue or a requirement in an IEP that you can't fulfill, what happens then? I know you mentioned the
I'll give you an
requests come up, but...
Yeah, I'll give you an example of, we had a student who had